lesson outcomes are vitally important. I think they're fundamental to good lesson planning, and indeed to good teaching. And perhaps there isn't enough emphasis on them, and it's quite unusual when you go to a conference or when you attend webinars that the topic is lesson outcomes. There's not so many resources about lesson outcomes, and that's what I'd like to address today. And I do believe lesson outcomes are vitally important, and particularly important for the type of teacher who's attending this webinar. I imagine the vast majority of teachers who are attending this webinar, you're teachers who are teaching many hours a week, 20, 25, 30, 35, more than 35 hours a week. And that many of you will have large groups of students, and you're extremely busy. And having clear lesson outcomes helps you to plan your lessons as well. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to jump straight into this, and what I'm going to do is just to say, what are lesson outcomes? I'm just going to give a working definition of lesson outcomes. This is the definition that we're going to be using today. So I'll just give you one moment to read that definition. So as you can some of the key elements here. So lesson outcomes are measurable, observable, specific statements that clearly indicate what a student should know and be able to do at the end of a lesson. Okay. I think of specific, measurable, observable. And one of the vital things about lesson outcomes is that they should be focused and centered on the actual intended learning. This is extremely important. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you when I started planning this webinar, and I've spent a lot of time planning this webinar, what the outcomes that I wanted from this webinar were for you. Okay, so at the end of this webinar, teachers will be able to write their own effective lesson outcomes. Okay, so this is one of the outcomes, one of the results, one of the pieces of learning that I want from this webinar. So I'm just going to go through 5 webinar outcomes, lesson outcomes for this webinar. And this also gives you an overview of the session. Okay. So at the end of the webinar, teachers will be able to identify and adapt the lesson outcomes in a course book to meet the needs of their students and teaching context. Okay, so this is one of the key things here. And as I mentioned before, that most of the teachers attending this webinar will be teaching many hours with large groups. And most of you will be using a course book. I think this is a good thing. The course books help you with your lesson planning. They save you time, especially if they have explicit lesson outcomes. We're going to look at how we can identify and adapt the lesson outcomes in a course book. This is a fundamental thing. We're also, one of the outcomes will be at the end of the webinar that you will be able to effectively communicate lesson outcomes to your students. I think this is vitally important, that we need to be very explicit about the lesson outcomes and to communicate this to our students. How can we do this effectively? And a fourth outcome will be at the end of the webinar, you will be able to activate your student schema, their prior knowledge about the lesson outcomes. Okay, and a final lesson outcome will be that at the end of the webinar, teachers will be able to involve their students in the assessment of specific lesson outcomes. So this assessment of the lesson outcomes is important as well, and we're going to be looking at that. So this gives us, I've given you the lesson outcomes, and this is an overview also of the session. Okay, so I have a number as we're going through the webinar, I have a number of questions, 4 or 5 questions, which I'm going to ask you, and which I would like you, if possible, just to write some brief answers in the script, so that the webinar is interactive, and that there is interaction between us and communication between us. So this question here: what ought to be the predominant outcome of an English lesson? Okay, write your answer in the chat. This is not a trick question. Okay, what would you say what should be the main outcome of an English lesson? Now, I'm not talking about specifically the past simple. What should it be? What should the outcome be? Okay, so to motivate students, that would be learning is says their list. Yes, learning is absolutely effective learning, progress. Okay, practice. All of these things are vitally important. Absolutely. Okay. And specifically here, these are excellent outcomes: communication, new knowledge, speaking. Fantastic ideas here. Excellent, excellent here. Now, what I'm just going to do, previous knowledge there, that's excellent there, connecting the previous knowledge with the new knowledge. Okay, speaking skills, lots of things there. Excellent, excellent, very much too many for me to read all of them there, but that's excellent to get your feedback there. Okay, so what I would say is, and what the research tells us is, in an English language, what the literature tells us, in an English language lesson, the predominant outcome ought to be our students learning language. So a lot of you put learning there, to learn. So learning language or skills, which then they can then transfer to other genres, situations, and topics. Okay, so as we are language teachers, the main focus there should be on learning language or skills. Okay. And the aim of English lessons is to guide linguistic, as we've mentioned here, the language, but also cognitive and affective change. And in this webinar, I'm going to be focusing on the linguistic and the cognitive, not so much on the affective, but the affective is vitally important, particularly in the situation of a pandemic and the isolation which students have suffered during the pandemic. The affective change is extremely important as well, but I'm not going to focus on that today. I'm just going to focus, because of time, on the linguistic and cognitive elements. So what different types of lesson outcomes are there? Okay, and I think when I asked the question there, you've put in the chat, you've already answered the question there. So we have the language outcomes, the 3 main type of outcomes. There are the language outcomes, there's grammar, vocabulary, functions, and this is fundamental, but also, as many of you mentioned there, development in skills there. Okay, Rosemary mentions there. So we've got the skills outcomes, the reading, viewing, writing, representing, listening, speaking, these skills, but also life skills, these rapport, empathy, social and emotional intelligence, these as well. Again, what I'm going to be focusing on today is essentially the language outcomes and the skills outcomes. Okay, so it's good to bear in mind the types of outcomes that there are. Okay, now another question, the second question I'm going to ask you here: how do lesson outcomes benefit teachers and students? I am a great believer in having explicit, very clear lesson outcomes. Will mentioned as well that he and at the school that he worked at believed in this. What are the benefits for teachers and students of having explicit, clear, measurable outcomes? Focus, Susan says focus. Help structure, Julia says. To have clear goals, concentration, well-being. Okay, the teacher knows what they're doing. To provide direction, a clear roadmap. I think that's excellent there. Okay, wonderful. Making progress, to know that they're making progress. A guideline. Again, these all of the things that you're putting here: clear instructions, satisfaction, motivation, progress. All of these things are fantastic, and all of the things that you're saying here are, when we look at the literature about lesson outcomes in language education, what you're saying here is exactly the things that are in the literature. Okay, so although this is an extremely practical session and you're going to go away with lots of practical ideas about bringing lesson outcomes to life, what I'd like to do very briefly, just a couple of minutes, is to go through what the literature tells us are the benefits of having explicit, clear, measurable lesson outcomes. Okay, just very briefly, just to go through this, but I'm going to go through the five main benefits according to when we look at the literature, but you've covered all of them in the chat, so that's fantastic to know. So the first benefit is that having these clear lesson outcomes gives clarity of purpose to the teacher. It's clarity, it makes it clear what's happening. And there's a predictive focus on student learning. So having this, essentially, it's having a clear focus. A number of you in the chat mentioned that, so that was great to see. A second benefit, it allows learning to be staged and sequenced. This, and again, this a roadmap, a few of you put there, guidelines there. So when we identify the key learning outcomes of one lesson, this allows it to be connected to the next lesson and we can build upon this, okay? So this allowing learning to be staged and sequenced, okay? That's fundamental. The third benefit is by having these clear, explicit lesson outcomes, it makes the assessment of the intended learning of each lesson much more precise and easier. It's easier for the teacher to assess whether learning has taken place, whether our learners have achieved something. And the fourth benefit, that these clear and explicit learning outcomes enable internal coherence in the lesson. These clear statements, these explicit statements become the drivers of the lesson. They drive the lesson forward. They move learning forward. And the fifth and final benefit, according to the literature, and extremely important, having these specific lesson outcomes doesn't prevent the teacher from being flexible and creative. Some people argue, or having these lesson plans, it limits having these lesson outcomes, it limits the creativity of the teacher, it limits the creativity of the students, it doesn't allow for flexibility. No, this is not true. I would say it's the contrary. It allows for greater creativity and greater flexibility, and it ensures more effective learning. And this is shown by individual teachers may teach a lesson with the same lesson outcomes in completely different ways. Okay, so I think it really does, having these lesson outcomes gives us a framework, and it sets some limits. And we know about creativity that having limits aids, having frameworks, having limits aids creativity. So this is what the literature tells us here. So there's no doubt that lesson outcomes are fundamental to good lesson planning and effective teaching and learning. Okay, now, how to identify and write learning outcomes for a lesson? This is perhaps absolutely key here. How do I identify and write learning outcomes? There's two factors that teachers should bear in mind. The literature tells us there's two factors to bear in mind. This backwards planning. I wonder if any of you have heard of this before, backwards planning. Essentially, this is to start your planning with the ultimate objective, your end goal in mind, and then work backwards from there to develop your plan. Okay, so you're saying what you want to achieve, that's the first thing that you have in mind, and you plan backwards from there. Okay, and having these specific lesson outcomes helps the teacher to plan backwards. Okay. So we should start with the lesson outcomes in mind, and so that we can choose the specific activities and materials to meet each lesson outcome, not to select the materials and activities first, but to have the outcome in mind first and plan back from there. So this is something fundamental when we're identifying our lesson outcomes. Also, the second factor that we should bear in mind is that the lesson outcomes should state aspects of language, cognition, and effect. Okay, as we mentioned before, the aim of the English lesson is to guide above all, principally linguistic change, but also cognitive change and affective change in students. Therefore, lesson outcomes should state principally aspects of language, cognition, and affect. I would say, and principally language and cognition. Okay, and that's what I'm going to be, rather than behavior, that's what we're going to be focusing on today, to help us and to help teachers to state these aspects of language, cognition, and affect. We can use a taxonomy such as Bloom's and active verbs, action verbs. So for example, in the cognitive linguistic domain, we have verbs like action verbs like write, state, listen, predict, identify, contrast, classify, compare, discuss. These verbs really help us to write effective, clear, measurable lesson outcomes. We have the affective domain as well. Things like listen to others with respect, be aware of, appreciate, judge. We're not going to focus on these today, but these would be useful for you. And as Will mentioned, you will have the slides here, but we're going today focus on the cognitive and linguistic domain. Okay. So we're just going to look at some examples of lesson plans using these action verbs from Bloom's taxonomy. So we've got, by the end of the lesson, students will be able to categorize words by using the prefixes. Okay, so we have categorized there. By the end of the lesson, students will be able to write to explain cause and effect. So we have to write there the action verb. By the end of the lesson, students will be able to identify and accurately pronounce. So identify and pronounce these action verbs here. By the end of the lesson, students will be able to distinguish similarity and difference through the use of comparative and superlative adverbs. So these are very, very specific, as you can see, these are very, very specific statements which will guide us in planning the lesson and choosing the activities and the materials and resources that we need to be able to achieve the outcomes there. Now, how to identify and adapt lesson outcomes in a course book. Now, as I mentioned when in the introduction, I believe this is a fundamental thing. I imagine that the vast majority of you are using a course book, and that you find the course book useful in many ways, and that the course book helps you with identifying lesson outcomes. When I was preparing and researching for this webinar, I looked at course books from when I first started teaching 30 years ago. I was a full-time teacher for 30 years, teaching over 30 hours a week for over 30 years, in fact. I've looked at course books from 30 years ago, and when I tried to identify what the outcomes was, it was the lesson outcomes in the course book. It was very difficult. It was very difficult to do this. 20 years ago, it was difficult. 10 years ago, there's a bit of a change. In the last sort of 6-7 years, it's much more explicit in course books that we can identify and adapt these lesson outcomes. One of the things which has helped here has been the Common European Framework of Reference. This has been used in course books, and so the can-do statements has helped a lot. One of the places to go, but there has been, as I mentioned, the last 6-7 years, there has been a shift that now the course books are focusing very much on the lesson outcomes. This wasn't the case 10 years ago or 20 years ago or 30 years ago. And this does help us as very, very busy teachers with many hours, lots of students, different levels. This helps you to plan your lessons effectively. It's very, very difficult for you to write, if you've got 30 lessons a week, to write 30 lesson plans from scratch. The course books can help you in many ways. And I think that we should use the course books. Now, what I'm going to do here, and as I said, there's much more explicit focus on lesson outcomes, sometimes called lesson objectives, in course books now. And I'm going to look at an example of a course book. And we can look, I would say, to look at the content of the course book, the content, just when you've got the content. So we have an example from Language Club, elementary level. If we look here, the content, the very first thing that we have is lesson objectives, the lesson objectives. When I first started teaching, this was not here at all. You would just have grammar, vocabulary, pronunciation, and the skills. Now, in Language Club, but also in other course books as well, we have very explicit focus on the lesson objectives. I'm just going to go in here now. So we have the objectives. The objectives is a synonym for outcomes here. So this is at a lower level at elementary. So the objective, the outcome is to talk about countries and nationalities. Another outcome, to ask and answer questions about a place, to talk about everyday items, greet people and make introductions. So when we can go to the outcome and say, okay, go to the content, look at the outcome. So what's the focus here? And then we could, for example, if we say greet people and make introductions, then we could actually write our own, write our own sentence, a clear, specific sentence. By the end of the sentence, students will be able to greet people and make introductions. And then we plan the class backwards from that, but using the materials or selecting the materials from the course book. Okay, so that can be done at a low level like that. We can do the same at an intermediate level here. Again, we have the focus on the objectives. We have the objectives here. Update your status on social media. So we could have, by the end of the lesson, students will be able to update their status on social media. This is a very explicit, clear statement of what students will have learned by the end of the lesson. We can do it going up with higher levels, with upper intermediate. Again, we've got the lesson objectives, the outcomes there, okay? And we have the third one is to give your opinion on the role of inherited ability in success. And so we could write our own lesson outcome. By the end of the lesson, students will be able to give their opinion on the role of inherited ability in success. It's a very, very specific and measurable lesson outcome there. And this can be done at advanced level as well. If we just go through, if we just go through here, so one of the objectives is to make a podcast or vlog. So we could write our own, adapt this by saying, by the end of the lesson, students will have made a podcast or vlog on trend setting, the topic of the lesson there. Okay, so I would say to save us time as busy teachers, to go to the content there, to go to the unit and just look. Very often now that the outcomes, the objectives are very, very explicitly stated, and this saves us time. It saves us planning time, and we can adapt these to the needs of our students. Okay. Now, so what we've identified, once we've identified and written the lesson outcomes, these have to be communicated to the students. I think it is important, as Will mentioned in the introduction, that students are very, very clear about what the lesson outcomes are. How can we do this? Could I ask you, how do you do this? If you have your lesson outcome, you've identified your lesson outcome, you've written your lesson, how do you identify this? How do you communicate this with your students? How do you share this with your students? What do you do? Would you like to write in the chat, please, what you do? Savannah has an agenda. A role play at the beginning of the class. I think this is fundamental at the beginning of the class. Somebody said, write it on the board, on the whiteboard, show on a slide. Yeah, in a PowerPoint presentation. Okay, absolutely. Okay, yeah, these are great things to write at the beginning of the lesson there. Okay, a journey map. Okay, that's fantastic. Okay, so lots of interesting things there. That's fantastic. To have a warm-up activity as well, perhaps where you might elicit what they are there. Okay, excellent, excellent there. Thank you for that. Okay, now one way when we look at the literature, seemingly one of the most effective ways of communicating this is through statements and written on the board at the beginning of the class. And we have an acronym, a specific acronym for communicating lesson outcomes. So the WALT acronym stands for we are learning to, and then afterwards we have the lesson outcomes. And this makes the lesson outcomes accessible to students. Okay, so we are learning to, and then the lesson outcome. Okay, so we've got examples here, and these are just from some of the lesson outcomes that we've just looked at the content of the different levels of language hub. So we are learning to ask and answer questions about a play. So we would write this on the board at the start of the class and perhaps discuss this and say, what do you know about this? And elicit, activate the prior knowledge of students there. We're learning to ask for, offer, and help. We're learning to ask for, offer, and respond to help. Okay, we're learning to compare, contrast, and summarize short biographies. We are learning to compare different trends. Again, you'll notice here that types of verbs that we're using here, these action verbs from Bloom's taxonomy: ask and answer, offer, compare, contrast, okay, summarize. These are very useful here. Okay, so these WALT sentences are a very, very effective way of making lesson outcomes accessible to students. Okay, once we've done that, we've identified the lesson outcomes, we've written the lesson outcomes, we've shared them with our students by writing them on the board. I think it's absolutely essential to activate the students' schema about the lesson outcome. So the schema or the prior knowledge. So the teachers we have to activate existing schema and build new knowledge or skills to achieve the outcome. We're going to look at some ways that we can activate students' schema, their prior knowledge. One way that can be done, and has been done, in my opinion, very well in a number of coursework, is through the use of images. Okay, so when we have a new unit, very often you'll see in coursebooks that there is an image, a spectacular image, an image that in some way attracts the student, shall we say. Okay, so we've got the image, and then we have a number of questions which are related to the topic of the unit and the lesson outcomes, and with a number and these questions are activating students' prior knowledge, their schema. So this is at a very low level. This is at beginners. So we have the image there. So where do you live? So we're with students already talking about the topic of the lesson. Look at the picture. Is this a good place to live? Why not? We're getting students' opinion. We're also promoting discussion, but we're also activating their schema, their prior knowledge about the topic of places to live. Complete the sentence in your own words. Life in a big city is, and they have to complete it with one of the adjectives here. Also, what we could do here with these questions to activate the schema, we could also use these questions to elicit what the learning objectives, what the lesson objectives might be. Okay, so they say, what do you think the lesson objectives might be? What do you think we're going to be doing in this unit? What do you think we're going to be learning? Okay. Then again, we could check the objectives there. We've tried to elicit the objectives. We could go to the objectives here. Here again, in language hub, it's very, very explicit. The lesson outcomes are very, very explicitly stated at the start of each unit. So we have describe your hometown, describe your home. Okay, we could also change these into we could write them ourselves. We could say by the end of the lesson, you will be able to describe your town. By the end of the lesson, you will be able to describe your home. Or we could use the waltz sentences. We could convert these into, we are learning to describe our town. We are learning to describe our home. We are learning to ask for and give directions. Also, we could come back to these objectives at the end of the class and say, did we achieve this? Did we actually achieve this? And we could use the can do statement. So can you describe your home or town? Okay, and so I can describe it. Okay, so the lesson outcome has been achieved. Learning has taken place. Can you describe your home? Yes, I can. Do it. Okay, so the lesson outcome has been achieved there. Again, this can be used not just at low levels, this can be used at a sort of intermediate, the same principle that we have the image, we have the questions to activate the student's schema. Look at the picture. What do you think of the activity the person is doing? Okay, we have a quote. Nothing is a waste of time if you use the experience wisely. So here we're introducing the theme of experience, and this is related to the lesson outcomes. What do you think it means? Tell your partner about experiences you have had. So students talk about experiences. So again, we're activating the students' schema, their schemata, their prior knowledge. We could also ask them here to we try to elicit what the lesson outcomes, what do you think we might be doing in this lesson? So it's clearly related to experience. Then we could go and check with the objectives there. Okay, we've got very, very explicit objectives there to talk about past experiences and things you want to do. So what we could do here, we could again change these into waltz sentences. We are learning to talk about past experiences and things you want to do. Or by the end of the lesson, you will have talked about past experiences and things you want to do. Okay, so make it very explicit there. Again, going up upper intermediate, we could do the same here. We could read the quote which relates to the future. The future belongs to those who believe in the beauty of dreams. This is the topic of the unit and of the lessons. So we're activating students' schema, their prior knowledge. So we need to connect this prior knowledge to new learning. What technological developments do you think will change the world in the future? Again, we're activating the students' prior knowledge there. Okay, again, we could look explicitly at the objectives there, try to elicit the objectives, look at the objectives there, rewrite the objectives as waltz sentences if necessary. The same at advanced level, we could do this at advanced level there, look at the picture. Why do people put themselves in extreme situations? So we're introducing the topic of extreme situations, and from discussing these questions, we could then try to elicit the objectives, and here we have the lesson outcomes here. Okay, so using the course book, particularly the start of the course book, with the images, with the explicit outcomes objectives here, trying to elicit the outcomes and the objectives and outcomes can be very, very useful as well. Okay, so that's using your course book. That's one way of activating student schema. Another way of one of the best ways that I know of activating students' prior knowledge is through the KWL chart. I'm not sure if many of you have heard of this, the KWL chart. So this was a graphic organizer invented by Donna Ogle in 1986, and it tracks what a student knows about a topic, what they want to know about a topic, and what they have learned about a topic. And this can be used at the beginning of the class to activate the schema, but can also be used during the class and at the end of a lesson as well. So this is, you may, showing it you here now, you may recognize this here. So we have the topic, what I know, what I want to know, what I've learned. And here we just have the explanation, what I know. In this space here, students use the space to discuss their prior knowledge about the topic of the lesson. So for example, if the objective was by the end of the lesson, students will be able to talk about past experiences, students could say what they know about this in English, how this is done. What I want to know, that here students look at what they already know about the topic and make some notes at some of the questions sparked by their prior knowledge, what they'd like to know. So they may say, yeah, I think I know how to make questions in affirmative, to make affirmative sentences, but I've no idea how to make negative sentences. So how do you make negative sentences in the past simple? Okay, they put this here, and at the end of the class, they write a summary to summarize their learning. Okay, so they reflect on their learning. They know whether the lesson has answered their questions they had at the beginning. Okay, so as I mentioned, that the KWL charts can be used at the beginning of the class to activate the students' knowledge, get thinking students what they already know about the topic. This is fundamental for new learning to take place, and to get them ready to connect prior knowledge to new learning. Okay, it also establishes the purpose for the lesson. This is fundamental, and sets the outcomes for learning, and it engages students in asking questions about the new content, about the new language. Okay, and we can use it during the class. So that's at the beginning. We're using it here essentially to activate their schema, but we can use it during the class, that students recognize that the lesson is answering their questions, and they can write down as soon as they learn them. It helps students to keep track of their learning by seeing that they have unanswered questions to follow up on. And students may add new questions as during the class, as they deepen their understanding of the new concept. Okay, and also it can be used at the end of the lesson as well. So students can use the KWL charts to summarize their learning outcomes using simple, easily expressed ideas. They can compare their learning outcomes to their classmates and add new ideas. And the teachers can also use KWL charts as informal assessment to determine whether students really achieved the lesson outcomes, and how to modify their teaching approach for those students who've struggled, those students who haven't achieved the objectives, to change their approach, or to plan in the next class how they're going to achieve that. Okay, so the KWL chart, and we're going to be using a KWL chart a little bit later. Okay, how can we, so we have identified the lesson outcomes, we've written the lesson outcomes, we've communicated the lesson outcomes, we have activated the student schema about lesson outcomes, and perhaps elicited lesson outcomes. A final thing that we would want to do is, how can we involve our students in the process of assessment of lesson outcomes? That is to say, how can we see if our students have really learned this? So self-evaluate, if you'd like to put into the chat, thank you there, through discussion, fantastic. Ask them to do can-do statements, that's fantastic. Peer assessment, self-evaluation through a checklist, these are all fantastic ideas. Question and answer sessions, Okay, excellent. Encourage them to reflect. Fantastic. Okay, we can do a fun quiz. Retrieval and elaboration. Fantastic. Lots of fantastic ideas there. Really love those ideas. Summary and reflection there. Excellent, excellent. And it is very, very important, as I'm sure you already know, that getting students involved in the assessment of the lesson outcomes, effectively, of their learning, is vitally important, and the students play a fundamental role. So there's two ways perhaps that students can be involved in this assessment of lesson outcomes. Through ongoing dialogue with the teacher, through discussion with each other, so that they're able to share, compare, and combine their ideas. And those are ideas that you put in the chat there. Now, what I'd just like to do is this ongoing dialogue between the teacher and the student. The teacher has to plan opportunities in the lesson to speak to individual students or small groups to check on their progress in achieving learning outcomes. Okay, this is important, but logistically can be very difficult with very large classes. Okay, this ongoing dialogue, it could be, there's three different things that it could involve: ensuring every student understands the lesson outcome for a lesson, giving students feedback regularly to help them move their learning forward. But this can be difficult to give this individual feedback with very large groups. When you have you're teaching many hours of class, you have lots large groups and mixed ability groups. This can be difficult. The most logistically feasible, and I think the logistically easiest way is helping every student to produce some form of evidence showing what they've learned. And this evidence can be written or spoken. We're going to look at some examples of this, how students can provide evidence of their learning. Now, one very effective way of getting students to provide evidence of their learning is through a review of learning at the end of the class, in which students discuss a number of questions related to the lesson and the lesson outcomes. This is called a review of learning. So we're just going to look at these questions here. We've got 8 questions here. We don't necessarily need to discuss all the 8 questions, but we could select the ones which are most appropriate. What did you learn from the lesson? So the students make some notes individually, then they compare with the partner, then they share with the whole class. What new vocabulary, grammar, functions did you use? Okay, so they discuss that, share their ideas. What did you enjoy about the lesson? Enjoyment is important, but what did you find most challenging? This is important as well, to say what students found challenging about the lesson. What would you like to remember about the lesson? How will you remember what you've learned? Okay, so all of these are important to get students to reflect on the lesson outcomes and also on their learning. So this review of learning. And we're just going to finally look at exit tickets. Now, exit tickets are specific questions or prompts about the lesson on a piece of paper. The students respond to these questions or prompts and give them to the teacher before they leave the class. That's why they're called exit tickets, okay? So we have an example, and we're going to use this one at the end of the webinar today to see if we've achieved our lesson outcomes. So the student writes their name, the date, and sort of 3 things I've learned today. They write 3 things that they've learned from the class. 2 things I found interesting. 1 question I still have, so some doubts here. So this will give useful feedback to the teacher here. So this is just an example of, there are different exit tickets. This is an example. So these exit tickets give the teacher immediate feedback about how successfully students have achieved their outcomes, but also they help the teacher to identify specific gaps in understanding, and the teacher can then think how they can be addressed in the next class. Okay, so this is another example of an exit ticket here. Okay, today I learned what they learned. I need more practice with. So this is good here, because again, this is for the teacher to identify, for the student to identify where they need more practice, but the teacher can also identify where there may be gaps there. I have a question about. So this is another example of an exit plan. Okay, so we're just going to the final thing we're just going to do for the last 2 minutes is just to another thing that we can do, students can help each other with their lesson outcomes. And that was mentioned in the chat. A number of you said with their peers, peer assessment. So getting students involved in helping each other with their lesson outcomes through discussion and cooperative learning activities is a great way to involve students in the assessment of lesson outcomes. And we're going to look at a cooperative learning task called Think, Pair, Share, which I imagine many of you have already used with your students, but some of you may have not. So this is something new for you. So help students to compare, to share, compare, and combine their ideas. Okay, so we have what I think, the students make notes, what they think about the question, the topic, what my classmate thinks, they share their ideas, and then what we will be sharing with the rest of the class. So they put their ideas there. So they think about their learning, they talk to their partner about their learning, and then they share with the rest of the class about their learning there. So we're just going to, an example, okay, if with the lesson outcome is at the end of the lesson, students will be able to answer questions about past events in a narrative. The teacher can ask the students to discuss the 5 W's, the who, when, where, why, to understand all parts of the story. The students would be answering questions like, so, you know, when did the film take place? Where was it set? Who were the main characters? What did the main characters look like? How did the main characters behave? Why did they behave in this way? Okay, students make some notes there. They share the ideas with their partner, and then they share with the rest of the class. So we have the topic there, understanding the narrative, the questions, the who, when, why, where, what. They share with their partner what the partner thinks, and then they share with the rest of the class. Okay, and exit tickets work very, very well, as a number of people are putting in there. Okay, so just the concluding thoughts here. I think lesson outcomes are fundamental to good lesson planning and effective language teaching and learning. But to optimize the use of lesson outcomes, we need to share these outcomes with our students. We need to be very explicit. We need to share them. We need to activate the students' prior knowledge about the topic of the outcomes, and we need to involve students in the assessment of the outcomes. And just to finish, what I would like you to do, please, just as a task here, what I would like you to do, we have an exit ticket here. What I would like you to do, please, in the chat, if you could just kindly sort of something that you've learned today. We may not necessarily to put 3, perhaps one thing you've learned today, one thing that you found interesting, and a question, that any question that you have, something that perhaps a doubt you're not sure about. And from these questions, we'll select the questions there and ask me in the Q&A at the end there. So perhaps you just might like to put, just for a minute or so, just to put into the chat something that you've learned, something that you found interesting, something that you're not sure about, that you have a doubt about, that you have a doubt about. So I can see people are putting in their ideas there. That's great. So putting what you've learned there, that's excellent. Okay, I can see lots of interesting things. So lots of you, I think lots of you like the Walt statement. Lots of you like the exit tickets as well. That's good to know. Okay, so that's good to know. So the Bloom taxonomy. Okay, that's great, excellent. Okay, the think, pair, share, some of you didn't know that one, so that would be a nice one for you to use with your students there. So that's fantastic. Those are some of the things that you've learned or found interesting. That's wonderful. And perhaps if there's anything at all, if there's any questions at all, that would be wonderful.
Hi, Kieran.
Hi there, Will.
I thought I'd pop back in at this point, just to help you with those with questions coming in.
Yeah, yes.
Should we start addressing them now, Kieran?
Yes, for me, that's absolutely perfect. Yes.
Yeah.
Any questions at all? I'd be happy to try to answer.
Thanks. So we're getting some in the chat box now. We've already had some. So I'll go back to some previous ones, if that's all right, first, and then we'll try and catch up with the chat box.
Yeah.
So a couple of people asked about the number of lesson outcomes that you could or should have in one lesson.
Yes, very good question. Very good question. Depends on the length of the class. Obviously, if it's a 45-minute class, you might just want to have one or two very clear, very specific lesson outcomes. If it was a 90-minute class, that may change things, that perhaps you would have, perhaps you could have more, 3, perhaps you could have 4. I certainly wouldn't have too many. I think it's much more important to have sort of the quality rather than quantity, and not to be too ambitious.
Okay, and so keeping on the subject of lesson length, again, a few people have asked about if you've got a 45-minute class, perhaps you wouldn't have time to do the exit ticket and or the KWL chart.
Yes. Okay. Yeah. Sorry. Yes. I'm not suggesting that we use all of these necessarily within the same class. You wouldn't have time to. You wouldn't necessarily. No. So I would perhaps, of the ones that you to use 1 or 2 in an hour class, I certainly wouldn't recommend using like 3 frameworks in an hour class. It would be too much, and it would perhaps even be counterproductive because we're covering the same area. If we're doing a KWL and an exit ticket, we're covering that. It wouldn't make much sense to do both at the same time.
And you'd recommend to do so, say you're doing a KWL charts, would you recommend to do that for every lesson?
Some teachers do that. I don't personally know. I don't personally do that for every lesson, but I use it quite frequently. But some teachers do and find it very, very useful. And if there's just something I would say is that with these is to become proficient with each framework. So the KWL is a framework. To become proficient with that, so use it a number of times, you become proficient and comfortable with it, your students become comfortable and proficient with it. Don't try to get proficiency, to gain proficiency in using one of the frameworks and then move on to another one. So I think sometimes teachers just use one and then they skip to another one and they never become proficient. It takes time for us to be, and for our students to become comfortable and proficient with these frameworks. I would certainly recommend using the WALT sentences, that acronym, in every class. I would say that in every class. And I know that lots of schools do like that, for the teachers to be very, very explicit about writing up the outcomes on the board at the beginning of the class, and not to rub them out, to have them there throughout the class. I think that was the case that you mentioned in Indonesia, Will, that your school was very big on being explicit about that. And I that's one thing I would recommend for all classes: use writing up the lesson outcomes, whether it's at the end of the class you will be able to, or the WALT, or another acronym. But that I think that would be that's very important.
Okay. And do you think so? I mean, we are getting a lot of comments about time, and this sort of taking a lot of time at the beginning and the end of a lesson. So do you think in some circumstances it might be helpful to use L1 to talk about lesson outcomes?
Absolutely. The use of L1, yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Right. I think that would save a lot of time. Using the L1 for the lesson outcomes, I would say is very, very useful, particularly at lower levels. I would say there would be absolutely no problem about doing that. And I think it would be, in fact, I think it's a good thing to do. I think it's a good thing to do. About the time, what I would say is, and I appreciate absolutely with the time, but I do believe that the course books help teachers, the busy teachers, help them tremendously. That the teachers, if they're planning 30 lesson plans a week, the amount of time that takes, they would be working 90 hours a week. The amount of time would just be incredible. A lot of that planning has been done by very good course book writers who are experienced teachers who've done that. So a lot of that planning, it saves the busy teacher, and those are the teachers who are attending this webinar, are busy teachers, it saves them a lot of planning time.
By using them to plan backwards. You have the lesson outcomes there and you can plan backwards. It sort of sets out the basics of the lesson for
you. Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay, so I've never actually had a question about how this might link to learning another language. I mean, I don't know what experience you have with other language learning, Kieran, but would it work with with French language learning?
Absolutely.
There's no reason why.
Absolutely, it's not specific to English language teaching. It's language teaching in language learning in general. Yeah, obviously the sort of an acronym, and these are used, like the KWL is used in Spanish, it's used in French, it's used in German, and they just I can't think what they used. I haven't used them in other languages, but they do exist in the other languages. Yeah, absolutely. They can be applied to any language.
Okay, so I'm just I'm sure we have had lots of questions. I'm just trying to get through. So another question is, what extent would you use these techniques with younger learners? So at the moment, I think you're talking mainly about young adults, maybe older teens, adults. What about younger learners?
Yep. Well, I think they can be used with, and they are used. This is actually, all of the ideas here are coming from general education and principally primary and secondary education. These principles here are for all subjects. They're not these, and the frameworks don't come from language education. They come from general education. So, for example, here the exit tickets are used at primary. It's used at primary. It's used at secondary in tens of thousands of schools throughout the world. Yes. The KWL is used. It's actually principally used at primary, but I think it can be used very successfully at secondary. Young adults as well. I've used these frameworks with a lot of my teaching has been from students from 60 to 80 years of age. These frameworks work with older learners as well. So I don't think that they're age specific.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you, Kieran.
Yeah.
So we've had one question from anonymous, someone who's asked, what happens if we fail to show the lesson outcomes at the beginning of the lesson? How will that affect the process, do you think?
Well, what I believe is that it can make it, to students, it may seem they're not so clear what's the purpose, and also for the teacher, what's the purpose, what are we doing here? So it may be, there are some times that there are some occasions, and particularly when you're using a narrative, that perhaps that you're using a short film or a short story, that you don't want to give too much away, and perhaps there's a twist at the end of the narrative, and you perhaps might not to be too explicit. But I would say that if we don't have the lesson outcomes explicitly stated and on the board, it can lead to a little bit of confusion and students not knowing where they're at and where they're going. Yeah. So I think it's like a roadmap which helps students to see where their learning is going.
Yes, absolutely. I think I used to have feedback as a teacher before I was explicit with lesson outcomes, and I think it felt to them like a series of activities rather than a consolidated journey. Just a series of
exactly.
Doing, whereas the lesson outcome.
Yeah. So those lesson outcomes are the driver of everything. Yeah. So if you've got that, they can see why they're reading the text. They understand. Okay, I'm reading the text because we've got that lesson outcome there. We're doing this role play because we've got that lesson outcome there.
Yes. Lovely. Thank you very much, Kieran. Do you mind if I share my screen? I'd like to show them something before you go, if that's all right. Can you unshare your screen?
Yes, of course. Yes, of course.
Thank you. So a lot of you have been asking about slides and recordings of Kieran's session, and we'll be emailing them to you. in the next few days. You'll have your certificate with the slides as well, and the recording will be available on the website, the webinar archive. Just wanted to let you know, so as I said, you're going to get the slides in the email, and the recording will be on the website next week, but also Kieran's very kindly written a blog on the same subject, which you can now see on the website. Go to macmillanenglish.com/blog resources. You'll find some of the information he's gone through today and more. And he's also very kindly recorded it, so you can listen to that as well. So if you're about to head to work or you're on the way back from work, you can go to the website, stick your earphones in, and listen to that blog that Kieran's written for you as well. So I think that's all we've got time for questions. So I want to take this time to just say thank you so much to Kieran for putting together such an informative and insightful session today. Once again, I mean, you've done many webinars with us, Kieran, and it's always a pleasure to have you here. And your sessions are always so insightful, and they are always full of things that people had not thought of, or certainly I hadn't thought of. So thank you very much for putting your mind to this today, Kieran. Very much appreciate it.
It's been a pleasure, and thank you again to Macmillan Education for inviting me, and thank you to everyone for attending and participating so much in the webinar. It's been a pleasure.
And also got to thank all of you teachers for coming. It's been wonderful. So we haven't finished. I've got a few things to let you know about, but wanted to thank you for coming, and also thank you the wonderful Daria Johina, who is in the background now. You won't see her, unfortunately. She's not on the screen, but she is always there. She's the person answering your questions in the chat box and making sure that everything runs smoothly. So thank you for your amazing continued help, Daria. We couldn't do it without you. Okay, so I wanted to let you know also about the course that Kieran has been talking to you about. So Kieran is an author of this course, Language Hub and American Language Hub. And as he's been showing us, lesson outcomes are vital when teaching and learning. They are at the core of Language Hub and American Language Hub. They've got a well-balanced skill syllabus and clear learning outcomes, and a functional language strand presented throughout the content of the course. So helping your students express their opinions using authentic language, as I'm sure we all know and agree, can really get some communication going in the classroom. And some of the examples he's used were taken from this course, Language Hub, which is a 6th level general English course for adult learners, as I said, which Kieran was one of the authors of. So the content of Language Hub includes, we've got an engaging sitcom style series, a video series, which provides realistic models for learners' own language production. And also there are additional authentic videos from The Guardian, which again offer further meaningful practice that aim to give students practice to develop effective communication skills. So if you're interested in finding out more about Language Hub, you can go onto the website there, it's at the bottom there, macmillanenglish.com/language hub. And you'll find on that page there are some sample videos. You can download the syllabus, learn more about the component and tools, and see how we've reconfigured it also to make sure that you can use it for any teaching scenario that you might be in. So yeah, go and take a look. That's macmillanenglish.com/language hub, or American Language Hub if you're teaching American English.